Thank you for joining us today for this policy conversation as part of the McKell Institute Victoria's digital event series. My name is James Paulock. I am the Executive Director of Superannuation Policy and Universal Ownership at the Institute. Although we are meeting virtually, I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners and custodians on the land in which we all meet. In my case, it's the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Today is the second in our two-part series on the future of work with Clare O'Neil. The first in these series was held in late June and focused on work and women. If you're interested in catching up on that discussion, you can find the video recording on our Facebook page. We'd like to thank TWUSUPER for co-hosting this event, in particular CEO Frank Sandy and Matt Rocks for their assistance in putting it together. TWUSUPER is an industry super fund formed in 1984 to support Australians working across the transportation sector. It's one of Australia's oldest industry super funds and supports more than 100,000 members with around $6 billion in assets under management. They have a keen interest in many of the policy issues being discussed today, especially around the future of work and ensuring on-demand drivers and food delivery riders have access to superannuation. Here in Victoria, we are taking the first steps out of our second lockdown and firmly thinking about our economic recovery from the current recession. So today's policy conversation is very timely. First up, we will hear some remarks from Clare, who will then be joined for a discussion and Q&A by two guests, Wade Noonan and Ryan Batchelor, and I'll have more to say about introducing them shortly. At any time, you can ask a question using the webinar's Q&A function. Clare O'Neil is the federal member for Hotham, first elected to Parliament in 2013. In 2016, Clare joined the front bench, and she is currently the Shadow Minister for Innovation, Technology and the Future of Work. Please welcome Clare O'Neil.
Thank you, James. I pay my respects to the Wurundjeri people on whose land we meet today. Thank you so much to the McKell Institute and to TWUSUPER for hosting today's event. Your fund helps ensure that truckies and forklift drivers and airline cabin crew around Australia get to share in the benefits of growth. I greatly respect how important that work is. Today, we're not here for any old policy conversation. Our ideas about men and work run really deep, in Australia in particular. Many of you will know that in the 19th century, Australia was known as the working man's paradise. Colonial societies had thrown off the class structures that so dictated life in Europe. And working class Australians, as long as they were white and male, could live a life of wealth and freedom here, unlike anywhere else in the world. That was the golden run from the 1850s to the 1880s. But in the 1890s, Australia slunk into a horrible recession. The economy shrank by 30% in 2 years, and a third of all breadwinners were unemployed. Many Australians lived in unspeakable poverty. Families crowded into shanties, women and children dressed in rags, begging for food on the streets. And the Federation was created in this moment of possibility, but also fear about what life in Australia would look like. The working man's paradise was enshrined in our system from the very start. The Australian Labor Party, the union movement, the harvester judgment, universal suffrage, and the White Australia policy. These laws and institutions, the good and the very, very bad, gave expression to the resolve that Australians shared 120 years ago, that in our country, working men would be able to care for their families. Our ideas about men and the work they do are deeply ingrained in our society and culture. Today, I'm going to talk about four things. First, how men are experiencing the COVID recession. Second, how big structural economic change has affected them over the last generation. Third, what we can do to create a better future of work for Australian men. And finally, I want to talk about the politics. Why is it that these problems, which are causing so much pain to men, their partners, their children, their communities, are not getting the kind of open discussion that I feel they deserve? This speech is part of a series about how different groups of Australians are affected by the future of work. Men and women experience economic change differently, in part because Australia's labour market is highly gender segregated. Construction is 98% male. Childcare educators are 95% female. And gender segregation is evident too in the way that we manage our households. 73% of Australian men say they are the breadwinner in their home, and 86% of Australian women say that they do most of the housework. I am deeply concerned about the future of work for Australian women. And indeed, in June at McKell, I gave a really detailed speech on this subject, which was focused on how COVID had laid bare these quite unique challenges that women face in the work that they tend to do. Today, my focus is squarely on Australian men. And I really want to have a conversation that's open, that's based in fact, and allows for nuance. When we talk about men and work, an assumption that I often hear is that men are the big winners in the world of work. And for some Australian men, that is completely accurate. If we divide up the Australian population by skill, by gender and geography, there's one group that's doing better relative to all others, and that's highly educated men who live in our cities. Now, nuance, not everyone in that group is doing well, especially right now, but on average, these are the best off people in Australia, both in real terms, as in right now, but also in terms of trajectory. So everything we know about the way that our economy is distributing growth and rewards tells us that this group of people are going to do quite well as we go into the future. But if you step outside of that Masters of the Universe narrative, you'll note that most Australian men don't fit that description. And today I'm here to talk about, in particular, the roughly 40% or so of Australian men who are of working age who did not get to study much beyond high school. So that's 3.3 million Australians. Again, some of the men that fit into this description are thriving, they're flourishing, they're highly skilled due to long years of on-the-job training. But on average, this group of men is experiencing a period of protracted economic decline. And that's a problem that needs and deserves our attention. A lot of the gender commentary about the pandemic and recession so far has focused on its impact on Australian women. And that's been absolutely appropriate because there's no doubt that this first wave of the recession hurt women terribly. Today, I'm going to talk about how the recession is evolving and how that is likely to change the gender dynamics. So to do that, it helps us think about the recession in distinct phases. First, we had an artificial phase to the recession. So Australian governments around the country shut down parts of the economy to protect Australians from COVID. So the sectors that were most affected at that time were hospitality, accommodation, and parts of the healthcare and education system. We also know that at that time, casual workers were more likely to be laid off and also more likely to miss out on JobKeeper. All of those changes affected women more than men because women dominate the worst affected sectors that were shut down, and women are more likely to work casually or part-time. Now we can see the recession is moving into an organic phase. So that is that initial suppression of economic activity that was a consequence of government policy is bleeding into most other sectors of the economy. So our artificial recession is morphing into a kind of normal organic one. Recessions bring two types of economic impacts. They bring business cycle effects. So that's like people like you and me stop shopping and traveling and buying, and businesses don't invest as much in equipment and machinery. Everything slows down, fewer workers are needed, and workers are laid off or put on minimal hours. But recessions also bring structural change. And what that means is that lots of businesses will use this downturn to change how they do things, to push automation, to offshore processes, to outsource parts of their business. And the end result for workers is usually really, really bad. It means job losses or good permanent jobs being replaced by poorer paid and insecure ones. Qantas is a really good example here. Despite having received $800 million in support from the Australian taxpayer, Qantas has said that it wants to end the recession with 6,000 fewer staff permanently after we're finished. In addition to that, Qantas has recently moved to outsource the operation of its entire ground crew. So that's 2,500 workers, probably in quality union jobs, that will be replaced by probably less secure, probably less well-paid positions. And of the ground crew workers, almost all are male. McKinsey has done some research which shows us where the job losses lie ahead as the organic recession sets in for Australia. And that work shows that the hardest hit industries running into March next year will be construction, 88% male, manufacturing, 73% male, and professional services. So that's like lawyers and consultants, of which somewhere around 57% are male. McKinsey estimates that as JobKeeper is withdrawn, as we go into March, just under 500,000 jobs will be lost. And our analysis suggests that more than 60% of those jobs will be lost by men. In other words, while women lost more work in that early phase of the recession, the analysis that I'm releasing today shows that as we transition into the organic phase, there is a tsunami coming for workers in predominantly male industries. And indeed, this gender switch has already shown up in our national statistics. The Australian Bureau of Statistics monthly labour force data shows that by September 2020, men were already more likely to have become unemployed as a result of the COVID recession. The male unemployment rate is now 7.14% compared to female 6.71%, and male unemployment has risen more than female unemployment during the period. Women are still more likely to be underemployed than men, so this is a unique structural feature of our economy, but the underemployment rate for men has now risen more than the underemployment rate for women. So male underemployment has increased by 3.5 percentage points since March, and male underemployment has increased by 1.5 percentage points. And we know now that more men have left the labour market altogether since a year ago. So this is people who are not unable to find work. It's actually people who have stopped looking for work, in a sense, the worst thing that can happen in the labour market. There are 47,000 fewer women in the labour force since this time last year, but 82,800 fewer men. And when we look at the numbers from March to September, so that's really the COVID recession impact period, the numbers are a little bit closer, but they still do show us that men are more likely to have left the labour force than women during this period. Now, I really want to stress here, it's not a competition between the genders, especially when we're talking about who's doing it tougher during a bloody awful recession. The point I'm making is not that women are not suffering. Of course they are. My point is that everyone is suffering. Women were doing it really tough to begin with. Now it's men, and there's evidence that as the months progress, we may see more of that. But I do have to note here that when women were clearly worst affected, it generated a very lively discussion in politics and media. And now that men are most severely affected, it just feels like a problem that we're a bit less comfortable talking about. Just an observation, and more on that later. I want to step back from COVID now and have a look at some of the changes in the broader landscape. Australia's economy has completely transformed since 1980 as a result of globalisation, trade and automation. The combined effects of these forces has meant that activities that are labour intensive and exportable have been sent largely offshore. Services are much harder to export, and that's part of the reason why so many more Australians today are working in service industries than they did in the 80s. Automation is a really important part of the story here. Since the 1980s, many Australian businesses have replaced at least part of the routine kinds of work that are done in their business with robotics and other types of technology. And I think the gender dynamics of this are pretty obvious. The kind of work that has historically been done by men that didn't require extensive classroom education has been manual work. And the industries most affected by all these changes, for example, agriculture and manufacturing, are dominated by male workers. Now, the changes that I've described here are certainly not all bad. Australia is vastly more wealthy today than it was in the 1980s. The forces I've described have created a lot of jobs. They've also complemented or made easier and more efficient many other jobs. But the problem, as is so common with economic change, is that the new jobs that are created require skills and interests that don't necessarily match up with the people who have lost theirs. And these changes have particularly hurt the 3.3 million men that I described at the beginning of my speech. So what do we know about what happens to workers who are affected by the types of changes I've talked about? The best evidence we have is from large-scale manufacturing shutdowns. And according to multiple studies that have been done here and overseas, the answer is a third, a third, a third. A third find full-time work elsewhere. A third end up underemployed, probably in a lower quality job. And a third never work again. Today, I'm releasing some new data from the Australian Bureau of Statistics, which demonstrates how the participation rate of Australian men in work has changed just when we look over the last 15 years. Now, the numbers I'm going to share with you are pre-COVID. I'm trying to explain the kind of underlying dynamics that will remain as the economy shifts over the coming years. Participation is the figure that is most interesting to look at here, because what we know is that for men of working age, they're very unlikely to be out of the workforce voluntarily. So according to the Australian Bureau of Statistics, the participation rate of Australian men of working age who did not complete a post-school qualification fell from 83.4% in 1994 to 73.6% in 2019. So what that tells us is that for the group of people I'm talking about, 1 in 4 are not in the labour market at all, and that this dropped by 10 points over a 20-year period. Now, for many of these men, significant drops have occurred just in the last 5 years. So for men with a certificate 1 or 2 qualifications, so these are TAFE qualifications, their share of full-time employment dropped from 82% to 77% just in the last 5 years. Now, remember that these dramatic falls all happen in the context of a growing economy. And I shudder when I think about what is going to happen to these men now that the economy is going backwards and wage subsidies are about to be removed just when they are most urgently needed. And I won't go into detail here, but one of the things that's very interesting about these numbers is how different they look across different parts of Australia. So Coffs Harbour, for example, saw a 10 percentage point decline in the participation rate of men who didn't study much beyond high school in just a 6-year period. So this is a profound change in the life chances of these men over a very, very short space of time. So like for women, COVID is not necessarily creating new problems for Australian male workers. In many instances, it's exacerbating a situation that was already pretty dire to begin with. So what do we do about some of these problems? There are simply no two ways about it. As our economy has shifted and changed, more rewards and choices are flowing to the better educated and skilled, and that is likely to continue. This is not a pitch for more men to go to university. I'm much more concerned about the men who are actually not getting the support they need to finish high school or go a bit beyond that. And as I said up front, this is not a small problem. There are millions of men in the Australian workforce today who are in this situation. And right before the pandemic, we know that at least 400,000 of these men couldn't get the hours they need or couldn't get a job at all. So that's an underutilised group of men, approximately the size of Canberra. Finishing school in today's economy is crucial, and I just don't think we've done a good enough job of explaining that to Australian young people. You know, my dad left school in year 10 and he went on to run his own publishing business, but that was Australia in the old days. We don't live in that country anymore, and we haven't now for a while. And yet still today, 25% of young men in Australia do not finish high school. These issues start early. There is plenty of expert evidence which shows that many, many Australian boys are not being particularly well served by our approach to education. And indeed, this is a problem that has gotten worse, not better, over the last 20 years. Boys are on average a full school year behind girls in reading. They are less likely to finish year 12, and there are very big differences between groups of boys. So boys in regional and rural Australia and Indigenous boys needing the particular attention of policymakers. Now, for some of these kids, going to school every day makes them feel like a failure. So why would they stick with it? Thankfully, there are some incredible programs out there which show the huge benefits we get when we take a different approach with these kids. I want to draw your attention to a program called Hands-On Learning, which is something that started in Frankston 21 years ago, but it's since gone to 110 schools around Australia. Hands-On Learning takes students who are at particular risk of becoming disengaged completely from school, most of them are boys, and it takes them out of the classroom to teach them skills and leadership and community services. And at the end of the program, the analysis has shown that hands-on learning graduates have an unemployment rate of 2.2% versus what is around 11% for young people generally. Everton Park State School in Queensland is another really brilliant example where the big focus in those senior years of school is about practical work and setting kids up on a really solid transition into the skills sector. And while I'm on the subject of skills, the Liberals' savage cuts to this sector have deeply exacerbated the problems that I'm talking about today. And this is a problem that deserves enormous national focus. Since their time in office, the Abbott, Turnbull, Morrison governments have cut $3.6 billion out of trades training. There are 140,000 fewer apprentices in training today than when the Liberals took office. What is so gutting about these numbers is that Australia has skills shortages in a number of areas of trades, including carpenters, plumbers, and metalworkers. So there are jobs there for some of these men and indeed women, but without the training, we're importing these skills from overseas. And that is a complete and total policy failure for which the government must be accountable. I've said that the economy of the future will continue to provide outsized rewards to skilled workers. That's absolutely true, but we're not completely unable to shape how our economy grows. We want to live in a country where quality jobs exist for everyone. And that's why I think this discussion that's underway at the moment about reviving manufacturing is so incredibly important. Anthony Albanese has spoken consistently since becoming Labor leader about his commitment to this task. There is a great economic and social opportunity here for the taking. I only wish I could say the same about our opponents. They're making some of the right noises, but as usual, when it comes to delivering on their commitments, they're nowhere to be seen. The recent federal budget earmarked $1.5 billion to revive Australian manufacturing, but we've recently learned that only $40 million of this will be spent in this financial year. This, the first year of recession Australia has had for more than 30 years. So the lack of urgency on matters like this is just insulting. A final point I want to make here is about quality jobs. We want Australian jobs at every skill level to be jobs that workers can count on. Since Bob Hawke was elected Prime Minister, Australia has become significantly more wealthy, but also less equal. And I truly believe that most Australians want us to live in an equal and egalitarian society. But if we want that, we're going to have to fight for it. Today, a third of Australians don't have paid sick leave. Labour hire and the many other creative ways that are used to get around paying fair wages and conditions are absolutely rife in the workforce. More than 1 million workers, even in the good times, don't have the hours that they need to get by. Wages growth is anemic, and underpayment of workers across specific industries is just an ordinary way of doing business. Much of this comes down to the Parliament. Good laws and the enforcement of those laws is the only answer to many of these problems. And I don't think we should be particularly surprised that after 7 years of a Liberal government in Canberra, these problems are so prevalent. It will be down to us, to Labor people, to union people, to fix them. 120 years after Federation, I think it's quite clear in some of the issues that I've discussed that Australia is no working man's paradise. Or perhaps more accurately, it is for some men, but not for most men. So who has the answers? Let me start with my political opponents. Stark declines in the opportunities of many Australian men have occurred while the Liberals and Nationals have had their hands on the levers of power. They promised to build dams. They promised to rebuild regional economies. They haven't delivered. Instead, they've slashed funding for skills and apprenticeships. They haven't done anything, even tried to do anything about wage stagnation or labour hire, and they sat on their hands when penalty rates were cut. I think Labor people and the Labor movement are having a real meaningful conversation about these subjects. And indeed, as a long-term infrastructure minister, Albo has probably done more to create quality jobs for Australian men than just about anyone in politics today. But there's a broader political culture here that I worry isn't leading to the kind of open discussion that I think we need to have about these issues in order to move forward. We're clearly comfortable about talking about issues that primarily affect women, and that's brilliant and important, and it's a conversation I'm highly engaged in. But I just wonder if we feel the same freedom to give unapologetic focus to some of the issues that I've talked about today. And it worries me because there are some crucial problems here that we haven't solved yet in public policy. We are building an economy in Australia where physical strength is not as highly valued as it used to be. What does this mean for many Australian men? The fastest jobs growth in our economy is in the care economy, aged care, disability, where men are really thin on the ground. Should we be concerned about that, and what do we need to do? Many Australian boys are simply not getting what they need out of our education system. So what needs to change? These are big national problems, but at times the discussion about issues affecting men feels truly fraught. One problem I see is that the public conversation, like so much of the political conversation today, feels to me to be really highly polarised. One viewpoint is that women have things worse, so men's issues can't legitimately be in focus. And another says that men are the victims and the ones who need their rights protected. There is a hell of a lot of space in the middle here. Surely we want a debate which allows for the argument for the advancement of Australian women and that that's right and important, but also allows an open discussion about the place of men in this new society and economy. We want men to engage in these conversations. Of course, that's crucial. But I also hear a public conversation that seems to infer that all men are in one homogenous group, and that's a barrier. It is absolutely the case that a group of economically and socially privileged men are the big winners in the future of work. But for many Australian men, things are going backwards. The public discussion just doesn't reflect their reality. And I worry because if we don't do a really good job at expressing these concerns in politics, more Australian men and women will look to the fringes, to political shysters like One Nation for that conversation. And that is terribly, terribly bad for our country. Now, none of anything I've said today changes the fact that there is a lot of male behaviour out there that's violent, misogynist, insulting, dangerous and generally despicable. And I could not hold that conduct in higher contempt. But the majority of men, of course, are decent. They lie awake at night worrying about how they're going to support their family. And they get out of bed every day and go out the door and try to do the right thing, to balance work with being a great dad, to teach their kids how to show emotion in a way that perhaps they weren't encouraged to do as children themselves. Men who are trying desperately to encourage and support the women around them. I think it would help if the public conversation created a little bit more room for them to breathe and just talk about what's going on for them. I don't think that they want to be pitied. I don't think they feel themselves to be victims. I think they have a deep, understandable human need to be heard. They are allowed to have grievances and I would like to listen, and I know I'm not alone in that. And my experience in politics is that you never lose anything from having an open conversation, because that's the kind of discussion that leads to new mindsets and behaviours and ultimately to equality. And isn't that what we all want? My purpose today was to describe how the COVID recession and the massive economic shifts which preceded it are affecting the working lives of Australian men. Australia is a much richer country, but much more harsh for many Australian workers. Especially those, as I said, who didn't get the chance to stick with education beyond high school. Now, I don't have all the answers here, but I see heaps of opportunities for us to do this better. I think we need to think really hard about how we're going to give boys and girls in Australia a different pathway through education if the one we currently provide isn't working for them. Surely we owe them that. The scandalous cuts to skills training and apprenticeships absolutely have to end, and this sector has to be rebuilt, fit for purpose, to train Australians in the jobs of the future. We need a more diverse economy. That means creating jobs across the skills spectrum, and the new focus on manufacturing will help that, though it's not the beginning and the end of it. And we need all jobs to be decent jobs, and that means the Parliament stepping up on core industrial issues like labour hire and the systemic underpayment of workers. I've also spoken a bit about how a better dialogue about how the world is changing could give real benefits to both genders. Broader and more open dialogue is where McKell has made an absolute name for itself in the Australian policy community. So I'm really looking forward to hearing the views of Wade and Ryan, and your views too on some of the issues that I've discussed. Thanks everyone for joining us.
Thank you to Claire for those insightful remarks. We'll now proceed to a discussion of the many important issues raised in Claire's speech. For that discussion, we are joined by Wade Noonan and Ryan Batchelor. Wade balances his time across a number of significant roles at RMIT University as Associate Director, Social Enterprise and Investment, and at the West Melbourne Economic Development Alliance as Executive Director. In addition, Wade currently serves on a number of boards and advisory groups in public health and not-for-profit sectors. Wade has worked in some of the most challenging and complex policy and political environments in recent times, including as Victoria's Minister for Police and Corrections, as Minister for Industry, Employment and Resources, and he was a member of Victoria's Legislative Assembly for 11 years. Ryan is the Executive Director for the McKell Institute Victoria. Ryan joined McKell in August this year after spending some time in the private sector. Before that, he was Executive Director in the Victorian Department of Premier and Cabinet, and previously served as Policy Director in the Office of Prime Minister Julia Gillard. Ryan will facilitate this conversation. So over to you, Ryan.
Thanks very much, James. Claire, fantastic speech again.
Thanks, Ryan.
We had the pleasure of listening to you give a speech in similar terms on the topic of work and women in June. And certainly those issues were relevant then and are relevant today. But I think it's an additionally important contribution you're making to the public policy debate, thinking about how the recession and the labour market, some of those issues that existed before the recession that are causing some of these issues and exacerbating these issues, and the impact that this recession, our first recession in 30 years, is really having on men in the labour market. So I'm really grateful for you being able to come in and join us today. And Wade, welcome. Thank you for joining us. It's great to have you here. What I thought I'd do is have a conversation with you probably in 3 phases. The first is just to unpack a little bit more about what it is we're seeing the recession do to the labour market, both in terms of what some of the underlying fault lines that we've seen in the labour market. You talked about them in your speech, Claire, and there's a few that matters that McKell's been doing some research on, which I thought I'd bring to this conversation. Then to look at how government has dealt with some of these challenges before. And Wade, you've got some fantastic experience in dealing particularly with the automotive transformation here in Victoria, but also some experience in the Latrobe Valley that I'd like to be able to bring into this conversation to figure out what have we done before, how well has it worked? And then I think turning the conversation to the future. What are the policy settings that Australia needs for our recovery, for the reconstruction that we're going to be able, that we're going to need to do in order to make our country get back to where we want it to be post this pandemic. And I also ask all those people who are joining us via our webinar to use the chat function, to use the Q&A, ask some questions along those themes, and I'll put them both to Wade and to Claire over the course of this conversation. We've got about half an hour. It should be a great opportunity to really get into some of these details in a lot of depth. Claire, one of the things I just wanted to come to you first, you mentioned some of these issues about underemployment. And I think one of the things that we've seen in some of the research that McKell's done, both looking at underemployment, looking at multiple job holders in the economy, insecure work, is that coming into COVID, things weren't 100% right in the Australian labour market. That we saw these, I think, clear fault lines of where people who wanted to work couldn't get enough work, and where people's relationship to the labour market was quite precarious, this problem of insecure work. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about what some of that analysis is showing you about how the labour market was positioned, whether it was people who needed more work and couldn't get it, or people who didn't have access to job security, and what impact you think that's having on the labour market in the midst of this recession.
Yeah, it's a really great question, Ryan, and one of my topics that I'm a bit evangelical about is our reliance on the unemployment rate as a kind of barometer for how well people are doing in the world of work. It's just not telling us very much about the labour market today. So if we just sort of roll back to the 70s, if you had a job, you were probably doing pretty well in the 70s. That is to say, you probably had secure work, you probably had a job that had a career structure and a clear path forward for you and your family. That is just not what the labour market looks like today. So we have this massive proliferation of people who are working part-time, and many of them are working part-time by choice, but a much larger share of people who are working casually, so in non-sort of standard employment. And this is becoming over time a larger and larger and larger and larger share of our labour market. So don't look at the unemployment rate anymore is my number one message. What is a much better measure for us of how well people are doing is the underemployment rate. And as you point out, Ryan, the underemployment rate before COVID was far, far too high, especially when the sense that the government gave us was that, you know, everything's going terrific and aren't we great at managing the economy? Clearly not actually true. So underemployment was a big problem. And, you know, we're here talking about gender dynamics, Ryan, and it's really important to think about how that problem affects men and women differently. What we see in Australia is that women face a higher underemployment rate. That is a structural feature of our economy now, because women face this real issue around job quality. Like, if there's one issue I could solve for Australian women in work, it would be job quality, because so many women are aggregated in industries that honestly don't treat their employees very well, where they're, bought in and out as the business needs without any sense of real security. On the male side, it's about actually the quantity of work that's available, and especially this issue of men's access to education or boys' access to education.
Yeah. I thought it was worth and I'm glad you raised it, I thought it was worth touching on the kind of experiences of men and women in this recession, because obviously we've heard a lot, and I think the statistics have borne this out, that when the lockdown came and the recession came, women were hit the hardest in terms of the immediate job losses, because we saw, the cliff that the job rates for women fell off. And there was a partial recovery, but what was interesting, if you look at some of those payroll data, is that big drops in March and April, a bit of a recovery to June, July, and then really that's kind of stalled. And there's just been this plateauing of any kind of jobs recovery, particularly for women, since July. What I think we're also seeing, and it's this point you made in your speech about the things that are likely to happen in this recession, is that we're now seeing some of those structural shifts occurring with companies. You used the Qantas example, which I think is a really powerful one of a business taking a decision to fundamentally restructure during the recession, which is going to have devastating consequences for large sections of its workforce. We saw announcements of BP in the Kwinana refinery only a couple of days ago, similar thing. Wade, we've seen some of these structural shifts occur in the Australian economy before. Obviously, as we all know, after the election of the Abbott government in 2013, they really walked away from Australia's automotive industry. You were in the Victorian government at the time, you were a minister, you had industry responsibilities when the shutdowns occurred. Can you talk to us a little bit about what the experience of trying to deal with those, when the car makers walked away, really at the invitation of the Abbott government at the time, what did you face and what did you have to do?
Oh, look, the challenge was enormous, Ryan, absolutely enormous. And, when I think about how big that challenge was, now I think about where we're at today, there's almost not a word to describe the challenge that's faced. But I think the difference, I suppose, with the automotive sector is that there was a period of adjustment, there was a period of preparation, if you like, to allow at least, workers to think about a career transition for them. What COVID's not providing for people, and really where we're going to see the sting in the tail of COVID, is about inequality, a rising inequality, because there is essentially no time to transition. So, for those workers, many of them had 12 to 18 months to think about what a career transition would look like for them. Without that, I really do have serious concerns about how deep and how long, essentially, this challenge will be for Australian workers. And I really congratulate Claire for shining a light on it, because it is quite uncomfortable at times to talk about these sorts of issues, because they do run deeply.
The other thing that, obviously, one of the other events that you confronted in your time in the Victorian government was the closures down at Hazelwood and the effects. It's not a recent phenomenon, the challenges that Latrobe Valley is facing with changes in the electricity industry, but obviously the closure of a big plant like Hazelwood had a large economic impact down there, large workforces that were, without a job and without a future, it seemed. Talk us through a little bit about the work that the Victorian government did there and what you learned from the mechanisms that we needed to put in place to deal with some of those challenges.
Yeah, I think there are a couple of lessons. I think when it comes to people who are transitioning in an economy where there's structural changes or where there's a serious or substantial jolt to a particular industry, I wouldn't look beyond the need for people to actually understand what their career prospects actually might be. It's often an overlooked step. We always think about, well, where will people end up? What job will they end up with? But if you actually think about the basic needs people have, it's to actually recognise that they do have skills. And there's a reason they do have skills. They're often learnt. and they're provided for. For people who transition to different industries and different opportunities, they need to pick up skills, but they actually have to understand where the employment trends are. For us and the audience here today, they'll actually understand instinctively where the growth in the economy might be in the future, but for your average worker, they won't necessarily understand where the jobs might be in the future. So just helping through that career advice, career transition is a really important step. And that's why the Victorian government at the time, and still does, supported skills and job centres in order for people to actually sit down and have a conversation firstly. Once that's done, I think workers need plans. They either need plans to get a skill or pick up a series of skills, and then they need a plan essentially to be introducing themselves to employers. Other things that worked really well, I think, in transition were simple things like career expos, for example, bringing workers face to face with employers out there. And these were often big events involving thousands of people walking through the door, the families often coming with them, but employers actually in a room looking for good workers. And if you're walking into a room with a resume and you're ready to work, your prospects in relation to getting a job are far better. I think there are a couple of things governments can think about, and we certainly did during the automotive transition, of course, Latrobe Valley, which I think are worth pursuing. Firstly, governments can invest in areas of the economy which are going to grow, and they can co-invest essentially with employers to grow jobs. But to go to Claire's point, it shouldn't be in a way that actually reduces prospects for workers, as we've seen in the airline industry. It should be really about providing an opportunity for workers who are experiencing those transitional challenges to get and keep a job, because government's actually investing. The last point I'd make is really about government using its own purchasing power, if you like, through procurement policies. Again, in Victoria, just as we're seeing transition in relation to some areas that you've mentioned, government chose to use its procurement or purchasing power in relation to major projects. And I remember distinctly the Westgate Tunnel project, but also through its purchasing, building rolling stock, for example, for a growing population, and providing opportunities for workers to come in. Again, I remember contracts involving the manufacturer of emergency service vehicles, again, where government was essentially saying to the market, we will use our purchasing power, but we want those jobs to be created as a result of it. Procurement and government purchasing is a real key and opportunity.
Yeah, I think those are really good points, Wade, and it's great to have your experience on the panel of actually helping people transition. Just a few points to add into that. I mean, just in the short term, the way that JobKeeper is being taken out of the economy is unspeakably bad to me. I don't understand why the government is doing this at the time the labour market is turning down. Actually, I think probably a lot of people at home don't realise this recession is just starting. We are just at the beginning of it. It is going to get worse and worse and worse, and probably peak at some stage in 2021 when JobKeeper will be gone. I mean, that is so wrong. And the good thing about JobKeeper is it connects people into their employer. So we actually don't want to have to go to job expos. Like, you know, of course, when people transition through industries, that might happen, but we want people to maintain their link to their employer to when things get back on track to still have a job to go to. And I'm very frustrated that the government structured JobKeeper in that way. On your manufacturing point, I mean, Ryan, the thing we should say first about the car industry is it never should have happened. The way that the government arrogantly goaded the car industry to leave Australia was one of the most profound acts of economic vandalism I've seen in the entire time that I've been in Parliament. And tens of thousands of good quality jobs, they said, you know, tens of thousands of good quality jobs are going to go, and that's exactly what happened. Thousands of people in my electorate lost their jobs as a consequence of that. So, you know, we're talking a little bit about transition here, but I really want to make sure we stay focused as well on the fact that these industries are good and viable. We need a manufacturing industry in Australia. It's critical to our economic future, not just our economic past. And we need to be thinking about, you know, for so long in politics, like you would experience this, Wade, governments are sort of slavishly, you know, said as almost as a religion that government shouldn't be involved in shaping how the economy grows. Everything we know about economics that's changed in the last 20 years tells us that that's not what the future looks like. We need government to actually be a bit more involved in shaping how our economy grows, as is happening in just about every other country in the world. So I think there's some things to think about there. And if I could just make one final point, one of the things that's really keeping me awake at night at the moment is about skills. We've got opportunities out of COVID too, like they're coming from a very dark place, but we've got literally hundreds of thousands of Australians who are out of work, many of them for the first time. We've got a chance to re-skill Australians in some things that we're not doing very well, and technology is one of my portfolios. So our tech skills in Australia they're very troubling, especially in a period where we're not going to have a lot of immigration. What a chance for us to help the whole Australian workforce actually skill up, and yet nothing's being done. Just beggars belief.
It's such a critical point, Claire. I mean, when I think about the workers who are most successful in transitioning from the automotive industry and also the power industry down Latrobe Valley, it was really skills were the key. There needs to be a flexibility, if you like, in relation to meeting the needs of the individual jobs that people are going to and what skills they might need. For some, it actually might be a longer program. For others, it might be a relatively short skill requirement that they need to acquire. But that's a really key focus, or should be a really key focus of governments at all level, to try and help workers reskill. They've got a much greater prospect. And I think you've raised something today in relation to the education attainment levels of men and the challenge that sometimes presents. I certainly found in terms of transition for workers that sometimes their most basic education needs were about literacy and numeracy. So, without a good level or adequacy in relation to those basic skill needs, it was very difficult for workers to think that they could transition to other roles.
And one of the issues that we see in the way the school system works is that as the economy is changing to become more knowledge oriented, and it's more about working in teams and EQ and all this other stuff, more about, really, knowledge oriented, the school system too is transitioning in that way. And that's not working for a lot of kids. And we're not going to have an economy where everyone goes to work in a lab coat every day. We don't want that, and it's not the right thing for our country. So I just think we need to have a bit of a think in the education system about how we design a system that works for all kids. And in a sense, like, some of the most important kids are the kids who are struggling to learn to read, never get that help when they're in early primary, and it stays with them their whole life.
Absolutely. I think making sure that we get from our education system both those important critical skills, but those fundamentals about teaching kids how to read and write, that are things that are going to last them forever, which is why something like that program the Victorian government announced recently to put extra teachers' aides in primary schools next year is such a practical example of where you can, boost employment in an industry that might need it, but also make sure that kids aren't being left behind. One of the things that I find really interesting, and I was reflecting on, your comment about your dad and how the opportunities that he could still have when he left school at 15 to go into an industry. I look at the experiences of my uncles who, again, left school at 15. One of them got his electrical apprenticeship at the SEC, and he's still working as a linesman today because of the training that he got, the support he got in those big state institutions. But now it's because of the investment that the government's making in building a lot of infrastructure. So there is a lot of employment opportunity out there for segments, and particularly male-dominated industries, that can have access to the right skills. So coming back to your point about skills, how do you think we make sure that that we use the power of government again to ensure that those opportunities are being created? In the past, we had big utility companies, for example, state-owned enterprises that invested in the future generation. Sadly, we don't have as much of that anymore. Wade talked a bit about procurement, using the levers of government. What are some of the levers of government that we could use in order to make sure that those opportunities are being created, both in education institutions, but then also on the job?
Yeah, well, look, I remember when I was Industry Minister in Victoria, we were very keen to secure a contract to build defence vehicles in Victoria. And it was down really to a couple. And, there was a couple of vehicles. There was no discussion about sort of local content provision within those vehicles. And remember that Victoria had just essentially, as a result of the Conservative government, lost our shipbuilding industry in Victoria, large-scale defence shipbuilding industry. And I thought it was a great lost opportunity, because if you're having a conversation about sort of minimum local content in building or contracts that government are about, that's where you can sort of add in a really relevant way the investments that you make in your skills area as well. Again, if I think about the opportunities that the Victorian government, through its setting minimum local content in its purchasing or in terms of building things, it then creates a conversation about the skills that the workers will need in order to fulfil those minimum local content requirements. It's a very sort of simple, I think, policy. Some might say it's a very complex thing, but I actually think it was really critical in building hope around local economy here in Victoria that would create jobs, meaningful jobs, because we know that some areas, the multiplier effect of creating jobs, let's say in a construction or a manufacturing setting, moves into logistics, moves into all those professional services and ripples through the economy in a really effective way. I think that's a conversation, I think, in a post-COVID recovery economic environment that we must be thinking about at the state and territory level and also at the Commonwealth.
Yeah, I really agree with you there, Wade. I think that's something that Labor's been thinking about a lot federally in the last few years. And just adding on to that, one of the things that I think has been probably one of the big job killers federally has been the energy policy confusion. So when you talk to manufacturers, some of them are desperate to make more investment in Australia and to expand what they're doing, but they're playing a lottery when they think about how much it's going to cost them because they don't know what the energy policy looks like. And it's almost more important to have certainty than it is just, we have this huge argument about what should it be. Just set a direction and follow it, for God's sake. I know that would make a big difference for our manufacturing industry in Australia and for other industries too. The other thing, though, I reckon that's so important, Ryan, and for people watching, if you really want to outrage yourself, go online and look at the skills shortages that we are having to import people to Australia to do. It is a bloody outrage. We are importing people to do things that Australians could very much be trained up to do themselves. And this is not anything to do with the immigration policy. I'm simply pointing out that there's quality jobs here that Australians can't do because the skills sector isn't working properly. And Jenny Macklin's just done this amazing report, this big process in Victoria, thinking about how we can fix the sector. But one of the things that's quite funny almost about this is that it's a demand-driven system, right? So free market thinking is we let students decide and they'll get themselves skilled up in the things where there are jobs being created. It just doesn't work. It just does. There is no question about it. It doesn't work. So we need to fix that. The accessibility issues are real too. And I don't know the specifics of the Latrobe Valley situation, but if you're in the inner city, you've probably got access to a quality TAFE institution. You might be able to pay the fees. The further and further out you get, the harder and harder it is. It's expensive to get into some of these courses, and we want to have a population that's as skilled as possible. So I think we do need to have a think about how we're sort of sharing the benefits of skills training. And the final quick point I want to make is, Wade, you talked a little bit about information about the labour market, like, in outside of policy ease, where are the jobs that are growing in my local region and how do I get the skills and where do I get the skills and how much is it going to cost me? We are hopeless at providing all the information that we have to people when they need to be making decisions about the future. So if you talk to young people, and this is not just my experience, but the surveys show, young people, they don't have good information about where jobs growth is. They're asking their parents don't have got good information either, and they know that. So I think one of the sort of easy wins here is actually for us to set up a much better system of talking to Australians about what the way the economy is changing and where the big opportunities are for them. And yeah, I just think that would be actually a big decisive step forward.
Yeah, look, if I think about the Latrobe Valley in the aftermath of Ongi making an announcement that they were going to close the power station, I remember making multiple trips down there. And one thing that became apparent to me is that the health and social assistance sector actually had a great need for jobs, and those skilled jobs, well-paid jobs. And you wouldn't automatically make a link between a sort of a power worker of 20 years experience actually working in a health and social assistance sector. But a good number of the workers actually ended up working in that sector because the jobs are available. Now, again, where do they get that advice that jobs are there? It's a really important question. I mean, I think for most, and I take your point about students, for most people, that might be the only place they get any career advice or any understanding about what the employment trends might be. By the time you're sort of 50, and you might be looking to transition to another part of the economy, where do you go for that sort of advice and that information? It's a really like a critical first step, I think, not well done, but important to open people's eyes, if you like, to where the jobs might actually be. And again, it requires a public discourse, if you like, about what's actually happening across various parts of Australia as well, because I know in the Western region of Melbourne, for example, logistics and manufacturing and construction are actually very big employers. There's a lot of growth in terms of population. You'd probably think over the next 10 to 20 years, there's still going to be strong areas of the economy. The same may not be said for other parts of Australia. So just actually nuancing that message, if you like, is going to be really critical.
Agree.
Reflecting on one of your points as we sort of round the conclusion of our discussion here today was that it strikes me that the way we're going to get through this is with a really active and thoughtful role for government in finding those solutions. The last federal budget was had a big headline price tag attached. But to me, looking at the measures, it's a very hands-off approach to the recovery. That we see from the federal government an approach that says, well, if we just provide a few tax incentives, a few tax rebates that are worth multiple billions of dollars, the economy will sort itself out. And I think you've so eloquently said, Claire, that when we look at how things like the training sector has fared over the last 10 to 15 years, sometimes that just doesn't work. And that what we actually need is a more thoughtful and considered and active approach from governments in thinking about how they can support industry and to give them the certainty, but also the confidence that they'll be there to support them over the longer term. I just, in conclusion, I just wouldn't mind you thinking through what do you think we need to see out of the federal government or out of a federal government, if not this federal government, to support this recovery as this recession hits us hardest next year? Because I think you're right. I think what we're going to see is as those big mechanisms like JobKeeper are withdrawn from the economy, we're going to see some of these underlying faults in the economy, these underlying fault lines emerge as real and substantial issues. There doesn't, to me, appear to be any way of addressing those from the current policy mix. But then I think we're also going to see, if we just leave things alone, let the market decide exactly how it's going to work, we might not see much progress at all. Claire, then Wade, I wouldn't mind just some final thoughts from you on what we should be asking for out of the federal government at a time like this.
You're so right about the budget. How can a government rack up $1 trillion of debt and not solve a single policy problem facing the country? The missed opportunity literally just staggers me. I think Labor's had a really constructive conversation about childcare. People probably don't think of the childcare system in its impact on workforce participation, but actually with childcare, the beauty is you get the win for kids, you get the win for families, you get the win for more women coming into work. And a huge driver of our economic growth over the last generation has actually been more and more women coming into the workforce. So I'd certainly put that on the table as just, 80% of families that use this system say it doesn't work very well for them. So guys, come on, we could easily have fixed that in the last budget. Obviously this government won't do it, but Labor wants to. If I could just share a couple of other things, I think the JobKeeper, JobSeeker withdrawal is going to be a massive issue as we go forward. We should not see the federal government taking away fundamental support for workers exactly when they need it. And I'm going to sort of keep repeating that, I can see, over the coming year. I think on the economic side, again, missed opportunities. We do need to have a different conversation in policy about our future economy in Australia. The things that drove growth for us through the 80s and 90s and maybe a little bit of the noughties was about, free trade, globalisation. It was things where government probably did need to be a bit more hands-off. And the big reforms that Hawke and Keating did were about taking out government structures in the economy. That is not what is going to drive growth going into the next couple of decades. A hands-off approach is not going to cut it, and other countries around the world know that. It's going to be about R&D, about science, about technology, about innovation. And this budget could have been a face to the future where we actually confront these issues. So I know that Labor's going to talk a lot more about that, and manufacturing's a very big part of it. The final thing I'd just say, and of course there's so much else to mention, but is about skills. This was a once-in-a-generation opportunity to change the skills profile of the Australian population, we're watching it walk out the door. There's still time. We need to double down our focus on the skills training system and try to use this opportunity where so many Australians aren't working at full capacity to help them get more choice and control into their sort of economic future.
Claire hasn't left me much.
Sorry, we should have planned this before. Wait.
That's okay. Oh, look, I think that the point with JobKeeper is a really strong one because, look, the longer people are out of work, the harder it is for them to come back.
Yeah.
We all know that anecdotally, and the statistics bear that out. It's the reason we've got to keep people in work, and if JobKeeper is to do that, that's a really critical point because there's a point where people start to lose hope and drop off. We don't want that to happen. So beyond the financial support that it gives to individuals, it's really critical. I think a couple of the other areas, and I've shared them, so I won't prolong it. We've got to be mindful that there's going to be a clear sting in the tail, but it's going to hurt some more than others. The challenge, I suppose, in terms of being in government is that whilst you have blanket policies, it's not going to get to where it's needed. So I'd just be conscious again about just sort of being really clear that we must target our investments as a government, both at the state and federal levels, to the areas where there's greatest need, because that will be the sting in the tail, the rising inequality. It's definitely a case to look at the procurement policies using government purchasing. I think in the aftermath over the next sort of 2 to 5 years to think about where the jobs can be generated. And the final point is the really strong one that Claire's made. It's very difficult for people to get jobs if they don't have the skills. And there needs to be a level of flexibility in relation to skill attainment. Often we actually look at sort of putting people into the TAFE sector, which is excellent. But for others, their skill attainment needs actually might be actually more micro. And it might come down to language and literacy skills, for example. I think we've got to be really conscious that making sure that every dollar invested, both at the state and Commonwealth level in skills, is really asking the basic question, will this help get people into jobs and improve their prospects as well as the state and the nation's?
Absolutely. Wade, thank you. Claire,
Pleasure.
Thank you. Great conversation, fabulous speech. And we really appreciate you both taking the time to join the McKell Institute today. And thank you to all of the people who've been joining us online. If you're interested in taking a look at the speech that Claire gave in June on women and the future of work, it's available on our Facebook page. And obviously a recording of this will be made available as well. As I conclude, can I thank not everyone who participated, Claire and Wade, but also to TWUSUPER for hosting us here today. They do a really important job in supporting thousands of workers in the transportation sector, and some of whom have been particularly hit not only by the impact of this recession, but also by the policies of the government in terms of the support or lack of support that's provided, particularly to those, for example, who are working at places like Donata. So we really appreciate TWUSUPER's support and also everyone who supports the work of the McKell Institute. If you'd like to keep up to date with what we're doing as we think through the impacts of the COVID recession and the plans for our recovery, make sure you go to our website, sign up for our newsletters, and join us at our next policy conversation. Thanks very much.